Welcome to the Evidence-Based Strategy Series, Guiding the Targeted Improvement Plan Process. Hi, my name is Kayla Payton. I am the Region 2 Support Lead for Nebraska MTSS.
And my name is Brooke Gabers. I'm the Region 3 Support Lead for Nebraska MTSS.
The Nebraska Multi-Tier System of Support Team, in collaboration with the Nebraska Department of Education's Office of Special Education, has created a series of webinars to guide the implementation of the evidence-based strategies identified in the Targeted Improvement Plan. Since we know that students that are identified as needing special education support deserve to be in the general education classrooms first and foremost, these webinars should be used to support district and school-wide continuous improvement efforts. As part of this series, there are 4 crash course webinars that will focus on each of the evidence-based strategies, 1 staff rollout webinar, 4 classroom implementation webinars, and a data-based decision-making webinar. The purpose of this webinar series is to enhance the classroom implementation of evidence-based strategies with a focus on Tier 1 core support and fidelity within an MTSS framework and is applicable to all classrooms within a district. This can be beneficial for school leadership teams to assist in the facilitation of implementation, as well as educators directly implementing the strategy and administrators supporting those efforts. Welcome to the classroom implementation on flexible grouping as part 3 of the series. Throughout this webinar, we will provide a brief review of how the Targeted Improvement Plan, or the TIP, is part of a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS framework. Along with this, as quick reminders, we will review major components of flexible grouping. We will then begin to explore fidelity, as well as the importance of fidelity within Tier 1 core practices. This begins with an understanding of fidelity within a MTSS framework and identifying ways to measure Tier 1 core fidelity of flexible grouping from a comprehensive view and by specific elements. We will end by connecting classroom implementation of practices and strategies to implementation science, which will assist with consistency and sustainability.
So first, we're going to review how the Targeted Improvement Plan, or TIP, fits into an MTSS framework. The goal of the Targeted Improvement Plan is to improve learning and educational outcomes for students with disabilities. Data shows that the majority of students with disabilities in the state of Nebraska spend the bulk of their day in the general education classroom. Because of that, the selected evidence-based strategy is intended to be used at the Tier 1 core level in the general education classroom. Research tells us that the best way to improve outcomes for students with disabilities is by improving education for all students. In order to ensure that each student has access to evidence-based practices as required by the TIP, we need to build structures and systems that allow for inclusive practices to ensure each student has access to core practices. There is clear and consistent evidence that inclusive educational settings can confer substantial short and long-term benefits for students with and without disabilities. What we know is this can occur through a well-developed MTSS framework. Remember, MTSS is how we organize the supports we provide for students. We identify the supports through a layered continuum that recognizes what we do for all students, for some students, and for a few students. We know that by establishing our Tier 1 core supports through effective instruction and high-quality instructional materials, the majority of our students will be successful. Once we are implementing our Tier 1 core practices effectively, we can accurately identify those in need of further assistance. Due to the interconnectedness, there is a focus on social, emotional, behavioral, and academic needs that promote positive relationships between staff and students. As we consider our Tier 1 efforts, we must continue to evaluate and strengthen our key foundational components that we know support all students in a safe, welcoming, and predictable environment. Through preventative and proactive approaches, we can provide social, emotional, behavioral, and academic support for all students while building positive relationships. Through processes such as the Targeted Improvement Plan, we can focus on the fidelity of implementing evidence-based practices such as flexible grouping by establishing a supportive atmosphere. Before we focus on fidelity, we wanted to remind you of the main components of flexible grouping. Flexible grouping is a strategy that is data-driven and fluid, meaning it's able to be changed if needed. It can be used to target the needs of specific students, and it is highly structured in that it requires intentional planning with clear, concise directives for students. Flexible grouping can provide the appropriate setting to accomplish the goals of the lesson, and it is best used alongside other evidence-based practices. Flexible grouping also facilitates the potential for differentiation of instruction or tailoring the instruction to meet the individual needs of students. It allows for intensification of the support students receive, as well as the individualization of instruction that might be necessary for each student based on data, the goals of the lesson, and student performance.
Now that we have had a brief review of the targeted improvement plan and flexible grouping, we will begin to focus on the role of fidelity within a MTSS framework with a specific focus on Tier 1 core. When we think of why, many of our minds go to Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. Simon explains the need to focus on the why, which is not simply knowing why things are done or a focus on the result. When we focus on the why, we are acknowledging the purpose or belief. In terms of fidelity, we will focus on 3 whys that have direct impacts on student outcomes. To really get to the why of fidelity, we will look through the lens of ESSA and IDEA and MTSS while keeping a distinct focus on positive student outcomes. It is important that districts provide equitable opportunities for all students. This should be done with fidelity to ensure we are considering and meeting the requirements of ESSA. Per ESSA, districts shall address the learning needs of all students, including children with disabilities, English learners, and gifted and talented students. This can be accomplished through the development of programs and activities that increase the ability of teachers to effectively teach all students, which may include the use of multi-tier systems of support and positive behavioral intervention and supports, a comprehensive continuum of evidence-based systemic practices to support a rapid response to students' needs, with regular observation to facilitate database instructional decision-making and provide services, programs, and strategies and interventions to all students in need. There should be a specific focus on ensuring that students with disabilities, with developmental delays, English learners, and need intensified supports can meet the challenging state academic standards. Not only do we need to ensure ESSA is considered, but we must meet the needs of all learners and focus on special education as well. Implementing instruction with fidelity satisfies one of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act's legal requirements for appropriate instruction. Fidelity of instruction plays a critical role in determining whether a student received adequate instruction. All students are provided with the opportunity to access general education instruction and materials, which should be aligned with state standards. In doing so, this will allow diagnostic or multidisciplinary teams to make valid determinations. It is also important to note that ESSA and IDEA both mention tiered support systems, which can be a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS. As schools implement and continuously improve their multi-tier system of support, fidelity is essential for both teacher and student success. When the skills to facilitate change and fidelity outcomes are developed, it is possible to create long-term systems change, leading to higher strategy effectiveness and efficiency. Through this process, staff will have the ability to identify gaps in instruction with more timely database decision-making. In doing so, there is an enhancement of core instructional methods. As we know, which is central to the why, this all leads to increased quality and consistency in student outcomes. Now that we have grounded ourselves in the why, let's identify the components of Tier 1 core fidelity. Before we explore fidelity in the classroom, we need to establish common language and define the word fidelity itself. According to the MTSS Framework document of 2023, fidelity is defined as the degree to which a program, curriculum, intervention, or strategy is implemented as designed through research, Within this context, we will focus on strategies being implemented as designed. But first, we need to understand the connectedness of MTSS and fidelity to enhance Tier 1 core practices. Fidelity is key to school infrastructure by ensuring effectiveness of a MTSS framework. Through the use of fidelity assessments, key components of instructional strategies, which provides clarity and consistency. When teachers are aware of these instructional key components and how to implement them, they are more confident in their instruction, leading to higher efficacy. Teachers also need to utilize fidelity data, which enables them to draw connections between the strategy they have implemented and improved outcomes for students. This database decision-making plays an integral role in enhancing a MTSS framework. Beyond this, when we focus on fidelity data, teams should make sure there are very clear responsibilities written so everyone knows what their roles are. By doing so, this allows for quality shared leadership to best support teachers and students. When considering implementation of your selected evidence-based strategy from your targeted improvement plan, there are two things to think about when it comes to measuring fidelity. As you may recall from the staff rollout webinar, as part of this series, there was concentration on fidelity to the process to address an MTSS framework systems approach to implementation. This webinar will explore measuring fidelity to the implementation of a strategy within individual classrooms. As part of this webinar, we will identify ways to measure Tier 1 core fidelity of classroom implementation of your selected evidence-based strategy from a comprehensive view and by individual elements within your selected strategy. Before making a decision around providing additional support, teams should ensure that the decision is a reflection of a student's need for additional support, as opposed to a need for effective Tier 1 core support. This might occur within school, collaborative, or student support teaming structures, which are dependent on the district. To distinguish these needs, the team must have confidence that the delivered instruction matches the instructional approach that originally generated demonstrations of effectiveness. This spirit means that evidence-based practice in a given tier need to be implemented with fidelity before additional and targeted interventions are added. In terms of continuous improvement, this could also mean that a goal might focus on the fidelity of an identified target change. When we look closer at fidelity, the focus is on measuring fidelity to instruction and measuring fidelity of instruction. Fidelity to instruction assists in determining if we are following core components of the strategy, as well as frequency of implementation. If measuring the process, we would want to examine if the teacher was following the core components or essential ingredients of instruction and how often they were using it. Fidelity of instruction looks at the quality of delivery and adapting to students' needs. When measuring the fidelity of instruction, we focus on the needs of the students are being met and if the teacher was able to effectively differentiate, scaffold, or adapt instruction. We also look at how completeness of the lesson is, student engagement, as well as teacher clarity. These are some questions to consider when thinking about measuring fidelity in the classroom. Please note that there are two separate sets of questions. Questions to target fidelity to instruction and questions to target fidelity of instruction. These are helpful for teachers to self-reflect, but also for teams to use when considering fidelity checks. There are many ways in which fidelity can be measured. Two specific methods that may be helpful for assessing fidelity in school are the use of fidelity checks and the evaluation of permanent products. However, for our purpose, we will focus on checklists. Fidelity checklists contain items comprised of tasks specific to a curriculum, instruction, or an intervention. These items are written out and checked off as they are completed. These can be collected via self-report or direct observation by a third-party observer. When developing a plan for assessing fidelity through a checklist, it is necessary to identify the core components of the practice or intervention that will be the focus of assessment. This is done by completing a task analysis of the instructional method. Then the checklist is created based on these core components, making certain that those critical activities for student learning are included. With that in mind, we do need to consider validity and reliability. When considering fidelity, we want to see both validity and reliability. Schools creating or selecting fidelity checks should look at the degree in which it measures what is intended or the validity. When considering fidelity within an MTSS framework, it is essential to understand the major components of the instructional strategy. When considering reliability of fidelity measures, staff can compare the agreement between two observers who are evaluating the same activity at a given time. For example, two staff can observe the same lesson at the same time with the same fidelity measure. This observation is an opportunity to enhance instruction and is not evaluative in nature. Shortly after the observation, there should be a comparison of the fidelity measure and discussion about similarities and differences. If there's a high agreement between observers, it is an indication that it is a reliable measure. To empower staff and promote shared leadership and collective efficacy, when conversations around fidelity come up, one suggestion from the MTSS framework is to have teams decide upfront together in partnership with those delivering the work exactly what fidelity to the evidence-based strategy requires. Monitoring fidelity to these core elements will then be a reflection of the agreement the team has made up together rather than something that has been imposed upon them. The measurement of fidelity should be the same in each classroom to promote both validity and reliability of the fidelity checklist.
Next, we're going to dig into some specific information about the fidelity of flexible grouping. This is a great tool that can be used either as a walkthrough checklist or as a self-reflection. It was adapted from the Department of Defense Education Activities Learning Walkthrough Implementation Guide 2.0. The checklist template linked at the top of the slide is broken into 3 sections around the classroom environment, teacher actions, and student actions. Observers can select yes, partially, no, or not applicable. And there is also a space for notes. What makes this such a great tool are the questions it lists for the observer to ask both teachers and students to gather more informed data. For example, if you're observing a classroom where flexible grouping is taking place, you might ask the teacher what formative assessment data was used to determine students' groups, or how they ensure that all students are participating in the group activities or assignments. You might choose to ask students why they are working in groups or when the last time their group changed was. Asking these questions will give the observer better insight to complete the checklist. A teacher could also use this tool as a self-reflection form after completing a lesson that utilized flexible grouping to strengthen their own practices. The Cedar Center and American Institutes for Research developed a self-assessment tool for all 22 high-leverage practices. The content of this tool is based on the high-leverage practices developed by the Council for Exceptional Children. The purpose of this tool is to provide teachers with a method to assess and reflect on their use of high-leverage practices. This tool can also provide valuable data on high-leverage practice implementation that can be used to guide professional learning and support. This particular self-assessment tool, linked below, can be used by teachers, instructional coaches, and building administrators to assess the flexible grouping practices within the classroom. This is an additional example of a self-assessment that was created by Westat. Finally, if your leadership team is struggling to find a fidelity measure that meets your needs, you may consider creating your own. When creating your own fidelity measurement tools, it is important to ensure that they are still valid or measuring what is intended to be measured and also reliable, or that you would get the same results from 2 different raters. We have provided a few resources on this slide that your team may consider using. Finally, we want to take a look at Tier 1 core fidelity through the lens of implementation science. If you remember from the staff rollout webinar, utilizing the stages of implementation is essential when guiding your team through a purposeful approach to managing any system change, in this case, implementing your TIP strategy. This classroom implementation webinar focuses on providing support during the initial implementation or elaboration stage, where the focus is, let's try for better. In this stage, The structures we have established during initial implementation help us to expand flexible grouping to new areas, individuals, or types. One key aspect of elaboration is that we continue to test our implementation and adjust practices and systems based on the lessons we have learned. A leadership team can use the problem-solving process to identify areas of improvement, make adjustments, and evaluate success. As we move through the elaboration stage, flexible grouping should become more established and more embedded into our daily way of doing business. This doesn't necessarily mean that all parts are fully implemented in all classrooms, grade levels, and buildings, but this strategy is recognized and promoted as a worthwhile initiative for all staff. Throughout this stage, you also want to plan how your leadership team is going to organize the fidelity data that you are collecting so that it is usable during the full implementation stage for continuous improvement. In the elaboration stage of implementation, school leaders and/or leadership teams should be examining multiple data sources, including classroom fidelity data and student performance data, to determine progress on action plans. As they review that data, it's important that leadership teams adjust and revise their action plans and utilize the problem-solving process as needed to meet the needs of students and staff. Another critical feature of leadership support at this stage is to continue to reinforce the overall shared vision of implementation that was established early on through actions such as public statements of support that signal these efforts are a priority. Finally, school leaders need to consider the ongoing staff support that is needed to facilitate successful implementation. This means considering what professional learning and structures need to be in place for all staff to be successful, and what the school provides to all. What targeted support needs to be provided to some, and what intensified professional learning, coaching, and support need to be in place for a few, so everyone can effectively implement flexible grouping. Even though this is not a fully exhaustive list, there are some good high implementation fidelity indicators to look for and reflect upon. We do want to make a specific point to address the professional learning needed. Too many times, we have the assumption that all teachers are aware of all things education related. This is simply not realistic, and professional learning needs to be prioritized. If you're utilizing the Continuous Improvement Plan or CIP template that was created in partnership with Nebraska MTSS and the Nebraska Department of Education, there is a professional learning plan embedded that your team may find helpful to ensure that all professional learning is tied to district and school continuous improvement goals. As you collect classroom fidelity data, the professional learning plan you set originally will and should adjust to meet more individualized staff needs. If you're interested in accessing the CIP template, use the link on the slide to make a copy for your district.
To review throughout this webinar, we provided a brief review of how the Targeted Improvement Plan, or the TIP, is part of a multi-tier system of support, or MTSS Framework. Along with this, as quick reminders, we reviewed major components of flexible grouping. We then began to explore fidelity, as well as the importance of fidelity within Tier 1 core practices. And this began with an understanding of fidelity within a MTSS framework and identifying ways to measure Tier 1 core fidelity of flexible grouping from a comprehensive view and by specific elements. We then ended by connecting classroom implementation of practices and strategies to implementation science, which will assist with consistency and sustainability. As we conclude, we want to thank you for taking the time to learn more about classroom implementation. As a reminder, this is just one webinar as part of a series. If you would like to learn more about the 4 evidence-based strategies identified in the Targeted Improvement Plan, you can view a crash course webinar for each of those. If you would like to learn more about implementing any of the 4 evidence-based strategies, we have a webinar titled Staff Rollout to assist in those efforts. After classroom implementation is established, which is from this webinar, teams can view the final webinar of the series titled Data-Based Decision-Making to assist in the use of assessment and fidelity data in order to improve outcomes for all students. Please visit the NEMTSS website at nemtss.unl.edu to view all of the webinars, as well as find the information needed to contact your regional support lead to address any questions that you might have. Thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful day.